My argument is that liberalism as a political, social, economic project has failed not because it has failed to live up to its own aspirations, but precisely because it has succeeded in what it set out to do. What it set out to do was to create a world in which human beings would be largely liberated from each other, and particularly liberated from each other through the mechanisms of a depersonalized state and a depersonalized market. And the more people have found that they are free of each other, the more that they have found they are also subjects to the forces of a globalized market and an increasingly distant state. And so it seems to me that many of our political crises today, what we're seeing across the West, is a reaction simultaneously against a sense of powerlessness in relationship to a globalized market. I think this is part of what's happening with Brexit, part of what's happening with the rise of populism around the West. I think it's contributed to Donald Trump's ascent. But I also think it's a simultaneous reaction against a distant, uncontrollable political entities. I think this is part of the reaction against the European Union. Perhaps the part of my book that received the most attention was to describe liberalism as having both a left and a right, or as a liberal, progressive, and conservative dimension. And so in many ways to indict and to characterize what we would see as the great divide in the Western world between conservative and progressive, as in many ways sharing the same basic philosophy of liberalism. And the great debate over the last half century has been one over means, particularly the means of the depersonalized mechanism of the market for the political right, and the depersonalized mechanism of the state for the political left. But both of these end up, in a way, empowering both of these mechanisms. So it has been less that the state waxes, the state grows in its powers as the market wanes, or vice versa. Both have increased as we become more and more fractured or fragmented. So I think it's that aspect of the argument that has been, for many people, the one characterization of liberalism that has been most pronounced. Well, of course, these are extremely important thinkers in the classical liberal tradition. And so, at least in the American context, they're often described as being conservative. In many ways, because they stand against where progressive liberals now stand in favor of market interference or public governance over the economic realm. And so many self-described conservatives embrace the thinking of Mises or Hayek, and Sam Gregg is someone in this tradition, as in many ways sort of the opposite of progressivism. But one of the striking things is when you read, for example, Hayek is a good example. Hayek has a chapter in one of his most important books, The Constitution of Liberty, in which the chapter is called Why I Am Not a Conservative. He's actually quite explicit that he's not seeking to conserve anything, no tradition, no culture, no way of life. He sees a kind of free market society as a society that's dynamic. And in many ways, he describes it as a society that's progressive, that's constantly changing. And in fact, he argues that a society that is ordered and oriented around a free market is going to generate more and more inequality, which means that it has to be a society that generates more and more change, so that those who are in an unequal position feel that they are in some ways keeping up with those who are in a superior economic position. So I think Hayek is quite frank that what he is in some ways arguing for is a kind of a free market version of progressivism, and this is sometimes advanced as a view that's conservative, and I think this is at least, let's say, a puzzling way to think of what conservatism is. I think in some ways it's I think of being in a political order as a little bit like being in a fish tank, where like a fish that can't see the water. And I think living in a political order always means that you're not able to see the nature of that political order. You're not able to see the deepest sort of presuppositions. And maybe more than that, Liberalism is a philosophy that argues that we are free to make ourselves, that we exist in a condition in which we are uninhibited to make ourselves. And yet the irony is that belief is itself shaped by this liberal order. So I think to see the paradox of the way in which our own psyche is shaped by an order that otherwise claims that we are free, that's a kind of revelation that I think many of my readers have come away understanding, that even a philosophy of freedom ends up in some ways managing the kinds of human beings that we are. I suppose it was the culmination of about 15 years of thinking about, in many ways, the deep inherent challenges of our own political order. You know, I came of age around the time when the Soviet Union fell, when communism fell. Francis Fukuyama wrote famously, "The End of History." There was a sense that the great questions of politics had been solved, right? The question of what is the best political order? How should we organize ourselves? What's the best way to shape a political order? It seemed that question had been settled finally and irrefutably, that there was no more question. And this seemed to me to be, at the very least, problematic, if not overly sanguine, if not overly optimistic. So I began just exploring the ways in which it seemed to me the liberal order contained, in many ways, contained sort of the seeds of its own weakness. This is an old way of examining political orders. It goes all the way back to Plato. Alexis de Tocqueville engaged in this. And I think it's especially necessary when there's a sense of triumphalism that's rampant in a political order, a sense of kind of overweening optimism. This is never a good way, it seems to me, to think of one's own political order without the capacity of a kind of self-criticism. So I think those are the main reasons I wrote the book. Well, I think often when people ask me a question like this, they're looking for a different political system. Is there a different political system? And I would say that the deepest problems of the liberal political order lie in a theory of human nature. It's less institutional, although that might be part of it. It's less, how we organize our political parties. Of course, it touches on our economic system. But I think at the root level, the problem of liberalism is an anthropological problem. It's a problem of the theory of human nature. It's the idea of the human being as this autonomous, self-making self. And I think many of our pathologies today arise from this disordered understanding of human nature. So I would say that if there is an alternative to liberalism, in some ways it's more radical than most people think, because it requires a real rethinking of what human nature is. But in some ways it might be less radical in the sense that it doesn't necessarily require a complete transformation of our political order. It seems to me if you populated our political order with different anthropological assumptions, that order itself would reflect those changes, and in many ways you could largely work within the institutions, but it seems to me those institutions themselves would work rather differently. The reception to the book has been fascinating to me. I think I'm often classified as something of a conservative, although many of my friends who are conservatives think I'm too far to the left economically. I suppose that in many cases it was the same people who cheered and angered. That's to say, it's many conservatives who liked a lot of the book, especially critiques of sort of progressive liberals, but who also disliked parts of the books. And someone you just mentioned, Sam Gregg would be a good example of someone who wrote an essay in which he expressed his admiration and sympathy with many parts of the book, but then was critical of some of my criticisms of classical liberalism. There were many readers on more of the political left who read the book and had the opposite reaction. They were quite sympathetic with some of the critiques of classical liberalism, but were upset by some of my criticisms of progressivism. I suppose one reader would be former President Obama, who praised the book but also said he had reservations about some of its conclusions. So I think the book has been interesting that it's in some ways bridged a kind of divide. It's appealed to a broad audience, but has ended up in many cases as in some ways predictable, angering and encouraging the same people, but for different reasons. Sure. Yes, and as I understand, broadly, the word liberal I think in Spain, I think throughout Europe, generally means what I'm calling classical liberalism. This would be the liberalism largely of the Anglo-American tradition, also Austrian economic tradition, free market economics, libertarian in its approach. This is one version of liberalism, at least as we define this in America. We also call liberal what here might be called social democracy or even socialism. In fact, that tends to be called liberal, often without an adjective in the United States. What I think is maybe the way we are increasingly describing that in America is a kind of classical liberalism, which is sometimes considered to be conservative, but as I've suggested, isn't really conservative, and progressive liberalism, which is more on the left side. And again, part of my argument is that there's a deeper sympathy between these two positions than we tend to really acknowledge. So I fully recognize that classical liberalism, what's called liberal in Spain and Europe, is a form of liberalism. But I also think it's necessary to see that what's often called social democracy is also a form of liberalism. It was a reaction to classical liberalism, but really more one over means. That is to say, how do we secure our independence from each other? And the argument was we secure our independence more through the agency of the state and the state's ability to provide the kinds of programs and benefits for us, not to have to rely upon the market or to rely upon each other, families, communities, solidarities, and so forth. So I think while the words are maybe different, I think the basic phenomenon is the same across Europe and the United States. Well, I've already mentioned one name, Alexis de Tocqueville, Democracy in America, is probably the most important book in my own intellectual formation. And in many ways, my own book, I see my own book as a kind of a re-articulation of Tocqueville's argument. Tocqueville, who saw that there were sort of self-destructive aspects of democracy, and that if democracy sort of became itself, if democracy wasn't corrected by, let's say, other aspects of life or inheritances that came from non-democratic sources. So he was thinking, for example, of family life, of religion, of certain kinds of traditions as counterweights to the tendency of democracy to result in a kind of radical individualism. So Tocqueville was a major influence in my thinking. And I suppose one other thinker I would mention is more contemporary, was the social historian Christopher Lasch, whose name is becoming, I think, more in vogue today. He was in many ways, it seems to me, prophetic in his prediction of a kind of populist uprising especially against sort of cultural and social elites in the Western world. These were books that he wrote in the mid and late 1990s. His book, The Revolt of the Elites and the Betrayal of Democracy, is a really prophetic book that I think helps to describe the landscape that we are now in today. I guess a mistake, maybe it's just a matter of growing older, is to be kind of caught in your own head, especially when you're an intellectual or an academic, to be caught in your own mind and your own thinking. And of course, it's an important part of one's intellectual formation to work through ideas. But I think I've found that as I've gotten older, it's through my interactions with other people, but especially with my students, that it helps draw me out of my own mind. And this is, of course, really important if you're going to be a teacher. I would say this especially to young people who hope to be teachers, is that you will not be a good teacher, it seems to me, if you only are trying to convey what's in your own mind, and if you're not trying to, in some ways, occupy the place where your students are. And it gets harder and harder as you get older to occupy the place where your students are, because your experiences are so different. And so you really have to be willing to open yourself to learn as much from your students as you are presumably going to be teaching them. And only in that way can you be, it seems to me, not only a good teacher, but a good thinker. Right now I'm reading a book called How to Hide an Empire by Daniel Immerwahr, which is a book about the sort of the quiet American empire. It's a fascinating book on, for example, it has some relevance to America's relationship with Spain during the American-Spanish Wars, when America acquires Philippines and Cuba. It's a fascinating book about how a republic, a self-described republic, nevertheless acquired an empire and yet never really wanted to acknowledge that it had an empire. So it's a fascinating study of kind of the quiet American empire. It's translated into Spanish. It's being translated into 14 languages. I was surprised that it was as discussed in the United States. I have no explanation for why it's become of such great interest in Europe. I'm being invited to speak all over Europe about the book. But I suppose if there's this thing called globalized liberalism, then there's also this globalized reaction against it. And it's interesting, it's taking the form of nationalism, populism, but it's also something that's transnational. It's, in other words, that it has very similar features across different nations. So what's happening in England is not dissimilar to things that are happening in Germany and the United States and throughout the continent. So it's a fascinating phenomenon, but I'm still not sure that I grasp exactly why this moment was so propitious for the book to appear. Well, I'm working on a book that I think is maybe something of a sequel to this book. The working title is Liberty After Liberalism, and so it's thinking about the question you asked earlier, what is the alternative to liberalism? And so thinking about a kind of post-liberal order. So I'm actually reading a lot of ancient authors and trying to, in some ways, think about what relevance in the contemporary period thinkers like Cicero, Plutarch, and other thinkers have for our time.